welcome to Tall Tales and Short Stories. My name is Chelsea, and this is Haunted, the Lost Season. We'll be reading a selection of classic ghost and horror stories. Today we're reading the story of The Inexperienced Ghost by H.G. Wells, and also The North Mail by Amelia B. Edwards. Halloween looks a little bit different this year, but I'm hoping these stories help put you in the spooky mood. H.G. Wells was an English author who lived from 1866 to 1946. He was a well-known author, teacher, artist, and critic, among other things. Wells was a major contributor to the science fiction genre, and he's known for his works like The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds, also a lot more. He was even called the Shakespeare of science fiction. Amelia Blandford Edwards was an English novelist, journalist, traveler, and Egyptologist who lived from 1831 to 1892. She wrote several ghost stories and frequently found inspiration for background characters in her work from personal experiences and people she actually knew in her life. It seems as though the story we're reading today, The North Mail, is also known by the title The Phantom Coach, and also, another past lodger relates his own ghost story. The Phantom Coach may be the more popular name from what I saw, but I'm going with the title of the version my book has today. If you're easily scared or a younger listener, these stories might not be for you. However, Mr. Wells, Mrs. Edwards, let's get started. The Story of the Inexperienced Ghost by H.G. Wells. The scene amidst which Clayton told his last story comes back very vividly to my mind. There he sat, for the greater part of the time, in the corner of the authentic settle by the spacious open fire, and Sanderson sat beside him, smoking the Brosley clay that bore his name. There was Evans, and that marvel among actors, Wish, who is also a modest man. We had all come down to the Mermaid Club that Saturday morning, except Clayton, who had slept there overnight, which indeed gave him the opening of his story. We had golfed until golfing was invisible. We had dined, and we were in that mood of tranquil kindliness when men will suffer a story. When Clayton began to tell one, we naturally supposed he was lying. It may be that indeed he was lying. Of that the reader will speedily be able to judge, as well as I. He began, it is true, with an air of matter-of-fact anecdote, but that we thought was only the incurable artifice of the man. "I say," he remarked, after a long consideration of the upward rain of sparks from the log that Sanderson had just thumped. "You know I was alone here last night?" "Except for the domestics," said Wish. "Who sleep in the other wing," said Clayton. "Yes, well." He pulled at his cigar for some little time as though he still hesitated about his competence. Then he said quite quietly, "I caught a ghost." "Caught a ghost, did you?" said Sanderson. "Where is it?" And Evans, who admires Clayton immensely and has been 4 weeks in America, shouted, "Caught a ghost, did you, Clayton? I'm glad of it. Tell us about it right now." Clayton said he would in a minute and asked him to shut the door. He looked apologetically at me. "There's no eavesdropping, of course, but we don't want to upset our very excellent service with any rumors of ghosts in the place. There's too much shadow and oak paneling to trifle with that. And this, you know, wasn't a regular ghost. I don't think it will come again. Ever." "You mean to say you didn't keep it?" said Sanderson. "I hadn't the heart to," said Clayton. And Sanderson said he was surprised. We laughed, and Clayton looked aggrieved. "I know," he said, with the flicker of a smile, "but the fact is it really was a ghost. And I'm as sure of it as I am that I'm talking to you now. I'm not joking, I mean what I say." Sanderson drew deeply at his pipe with one reddish eye on Clayton, and then emitted a thin jet of smoke more eloquent than any words. Clayton ignored the comment. "It is the strangest thing that has ever happened in my life. You know, I never believed in ghosts or anything of the sort before. Ever. And then, you know, I bag one in a corner and the whole business is in my hands." He meditated still more profoundly and produced and began to pierce a second cigar with a curious little stabber he had affected. "You talked to it?" asked Wish. "For the space, probably, of an hour. Chatty?" I said, joining the party of skeptics. The poor devil was in trouble, said Clayton, bowed over his cigar end with the very faintest note of reproof. Sobbing? Someone asked. Clayton heaved a realistic sigh at the memory. Good Lord, he said. Yes! And then, poor fellow, yes. Where did you strike it? Asked Evans in his best American accent. I never realized, asked Clayton, ignoring him. The poor sort of thing a ghost might be, and he hung us up again for a time while he sought for matches in his pocket and lit and warmed to his cigar. I took an advantage, he reflected at last. We were none of us in a hurry. A character, he said, remains just the same character for all that it's been disembodied. That's the thing we too often forget. People with a certain strength or fixity of purpose may have ghosts of a certain strength and fixity of purpose. Most haunting ghosts, must be as one-ideaed as monomaniacs and as obstinate as mules to come back again and again. This poor creature wasn't. He suddenly looked up rather queerly, and his eye went around the room. I say it, he said, in all kindliness, but that is the plain truth of the case. Even at the first glance he struck me as weak, he punctuated, with the help of his cigar. I came upon him, in the long passage. His back was towards me, and I saw him first. Right off, I knew him for a ghost. He was transparent and whitish. Clean through his chest I could see the glimmer of the little window at the end. And not only his physique, but his attitude struck me as being weak. He looked, as though he didn't know in the slightest whatever he meant to do. One hand was on the paneling, and the other fluttered to his mouth, like so. What sort of physique? Said Sanderson. Lean. You know that sort of young man's neck that has the two great flutings down the back, here and here, so. And a little meanish head with scrubby hair. And rather bad ears. Shoulders bad, narrower than the hips. Turned-down collar, ready-made short jacket, trousers baggy, and a little frayed at the heels. That's how he took me. I came very quietly up the staircase. I did not carry a light, The candles are on the landing table, and there is that lamp. And I was in my list slippers, and I saw him as I came up. I stopped dead at that, taking him in. I wasn't a bit afraid. I think that in most of these affairs one is never nearly so afraid or excited as one imagines one would be. I was surprised and interested. I thought, good Lord, here's a ghost at last! And I haven't believed for a moment in ghosts during the last 25 years. Said Wish. I suppose I wasn't on the landing a moment before he found out I was there. He turned on me sharply, and I saw the face of an immature young man, a weak nose, a scrubby little mustache, a feeble chin. So for an instant we stood, he looking over his shoulder at me, and regarded one another. Then he seemed to remember his high calling. He turned round, drew himself up, projected his face, raised his arms, spread his hands in approved ghost fashion, came towards me. As he did so, his little jaw dropped, and he emitted a faint, drawn-out, ooh. No, it wasn't. Not a bit dreadful. I'd dined. I'd had a bottle of champagne, and being all alone, perhaps 2 or 3, perhaps even 4 or 5 whiskeys, so I was as solid as rocks, and no more frightened than if I'd been assailed by a frog. Boo, I said. Nonsense. You don't belong to this place. What are you doing here? I could see him wince. Boo, he said. Boo, be hanged! Are you a member? I said, and just to show I didn't care a pin for him, I stepped through a corner of him and made to light my candle. Are you a member? I repeated, looking at him sideways. He moved a little so as to stand clear of me, and his bearing became crestfallen. No, he said, in answer to the persistent interrogation of my eye. I'm not a member. I'm a ghost. Well, that doesn't give you the run of the Mermaid Club. Is there anyone you want to see, or anything of that sort? And doing it as steadily as possible for fear that he should mistake the carelessness of whiskey for the distraction of fear, I got my candle alight. I turned on him, holding it. What are you doing here? I said. He had dropped his hands and stopped his booing, and there he stood, abashed and awkward, the ghost of a weak, silly, aimless young man. I'm haunting, he said. You haven't any business to, I said in a quiet voice. I'm a ghost, he said, as if in defense. That may be, but you haven't any business to haunt here. This is a respectable private club. People often stop here with nursemaids and children, and going about in the careless way you do, some poor little mite could easily come upon you and be scared out of her wits. I suppose you didn't think of that." "No, sir," he said. "I didn't." "You should have done. You haven't any claim on the place, have you? Weren't murdered here or anything of that sort?" "None, sir, but I thought as it was old and oak-paneled—" "That's no excuse." I regarded him firmly. "Your coming here is a mistake," I said in a tone of friendly superiority. I feigned to see if I had my matches, and then looked up at him frankly. "If I were you, I wouldn't wait for cockcrow. I'd vanish right away." He looked embarrassed. "The fact is, sir," he began. "I'd vanish," I said, driving it home. "The fact is, sir, that somehow I can't." "You can't?" "No, sir. There's something I've forgotten. I've been hanging about here since midnight last night, hiding in the cupboards of the empty bedrooms and things like that. I'm flurried. I've never come haunting before, and it seems to put me out." "Put you out?" "Yes, sir. I've tried to do it several times, and it doesn't come off. There's some little thing has slipped me, and I can't get back." That, you know, rather bowled me over. He looked at me in such an abject way that for the life of me I couldn't keep up quite the high, hectoring vein I adopted. "That's queer," I said, and as I spoke I fancied I heard someone moving about down below. "Come into my room and tell me more about it," I said. I didn't, of course, understand this, and I tried to take him by the arm. But of course, you might as well have tried to take a hold of a puff of smoke. I had forgotten my number, I think, anyhow. I remember going into several bedrooms. It was lucky I was the only soul in that wing until I saw my traps. "Here we are," I said, and sat down in the armchair. "Sit down and tell me all about it. It seems to me you've got yourself into a jolly awkward position, old chap." Well, he said he wouldn't sit down. He'd prefer to flit up and down the room as if it was all the same to me. And so he did, and in a little while we were deep in a long and serious talk, and presently, you know, something of those whiskeys and sodas evaporated out of me, and I began to realize just a little what a thundering rum and weird business it was that I was in. There he was, semi-transparent, the proper conventional phantom, and noiseless except for his ghost of a voice, flitting to and fro in that nice, clean, chintz-hung old bedroom. You could see the gleam of the copper candlesticks through him, and the lights on the brass fender, and the corners of the framed engravings on the wall, and there he was, telling me all about this wretched little life of his that had recently ended on Earth. He hadn't a particularly honest face, you know, but being transparent, of course, he couldn't avoid telling the truth. "Eh?" said Wish, suddenly sitting up in his chair. "What?" said Clayton. "Being transparent, couldn't avoid telling the truth? I don't see it," said Wish. "I don't see it," said Clayton, with inimitable assurance. "But it is so, I can assure you nevertheless. I don't believe he once got a nail's breadth off the Bible truth. He told me how he had been killed. He went down into a London basement with a candle to look for a leakage of gas, and described himself as a senior English master in a London private school when that release occurred." "Poor wretch," said I. "That's what I thought, and the more he talked, the more I thought it. There he was, purposeless in life and purposeless out of it. He talked of his father and mother and his schoolmaster, and all who had ever been anything to him in the world meanly. He had been too sensitive, too nervous. None of them had ever valued him properly or understood him, he said. He had never had a real friend in the world, I think. He had never had a success. He had shirked games and failed examinations. It's like that with some people, he said. Whenever I got into the examination room or anywhere, everything seemed to go. Engaged to be married, of course, to another oversensitive person, I suppose, when the indiscretion with the gas escape ended his affairs. "And where are you now?" I asked. "Not in—" He wasn't clear on that point at all. The impression he gave me was of a sort of vague intermediate state, a special reserve for souls too non-existent for anything so positive as either sin or virtue. I don't know. He was much too egotistical and unobservant to give me any clear idea of the kind of place, kind of country, there is on the other side of things. Wherever he was, he seemed to have fallen in with a set of kindred spirits, ghosts of weak Cockney young men who were on a footing of Christian names, and among those there was certainly a lot of talk about going haunting and things like that. Yes, going haunting. They seemed to think haunting a tremendous adventure, and most of them funked it all the time. And so primed, he had come. But really, said Wish to the fire. These are the impressions he gave me, anyhow, said Clayton modestly. I may, of course, have been in a rather uncritical state, but that was the sort of background he gave to himself. He kept flitting up and down with his thin voice going talking about his wretched self, and never a word of clear, firm statement from first to last. He was thinner and sillier and more pointless than if he had been real and alive. Only then, he would not have been in my bedroom here. If he had been alive, I should have kicked him out. Of course, said Evans. There are poor mortals like that. And there's just as much chance of their having ghosts as the rest of us, I admitted. What gave a sort of point to him, was the fact that he didn't seem within limits to have found himself out. The mess he had made of haunting had depressed him terribly. He had been told that it would be a lark. He had come expecting it to be a lark. And here he was, nothing but another failure added to his record. He proclaimed himself an utter out-and-out failure. He said, and I can quite believe it, that he had never tried to do anything all his life that he hadn't made a perfect mess of. And through all the waste of eternity, he never would. If he had sympathy, perhaps. He paused at that and stood regarding me. He remarked that, strange as it might seem to me, nobody, not anyone ever, had given him the amount of sympathy I was doing now. I could see what he wanted straight away, and I determined to head him off at once. I may be a brute, but being the only real friend, the recipient of the confidences of one of these egotistical weaklings, ghost or body, is beyond my physical endurance. I got up briskly. Don't you brood on these things too much, I said. The thing you've got to do is to get out of this sharp. You pull yourself together and try. I can't, he said. You try, I said, and try he did. Try, said Sanderson. How? Passes, said Clayton. Passes? Complicated series of gestures and passes with the hands. That's how he had come in, and that's how he had to get out again. Lord, what a business I had. But how could any series of passes, I began. My dear man, said Clayton, turning on me and putting a great emphasis on certain words. You want everything clear. I do not know how. All I know is that you do, that he did, anyhow, at least. After a fearful time, he got his passes right and suddenly disappeared. Did you, said Sanderson slowly, observe the passes? Yes, said Clayton, and seemed to think. It was tremendously queer, he said. There we were, I and this thin, vague ghost in that silent room, in this silent, empty inn, in this silent little Friday night town. Not a sound except our voices and a faint panting he made when he swung. There was the bedroom candle, and one candle on the dressing table alight. That was all. Sometimes one or the other would flare up into a tall, lean, astonished flame for a space, and queer things happened. I can't, he said. I shall never. And suddenly he sat down on a little chair at the foot of the bed and began to sob and sob. Lord, what a harrowing, whimpering thing he seemed. You pull yourself together, I said, and tried to pat him on the back, and my confounded hand went through him. By that time, I wasn't nearly so massive as I had been on the landing. I got the queerness of it full. I remember snatching back my hand out of him, as it were, with a little thrill, and walking over to the dressing table. You pull yourself together, I said to him, and try. And in order to encourage him, I began to try as well. What? Said Sanderson. The passes? Yes, the passes. But, I said, moved by an idea that eluded me for a space. This is interesting, said Sanderson, with his finger in his pipe bowl. You mean to say this ghost of yours did his level best to give away the whole confounded barrier? Yes. He didn't, said Wish. He couldn't, or you'd have gone there too. That's precisely it, I said, finding my elusive idea put into words for me. That is precisely it, said Clayton, with thoughtful eyes upon the fire. For just a little while there was silence. And at last he did it? Said Sanderson. At last he did it. I had to keep him up to it hard, but he did at last, rather suddenly. He despaired, we had a scene, and then he got up abruptly and asked me to go through the whole performance, slowly, so that he might see. I believe, he said, if I could see, I should spot what was wrong at once. And he did. I know, he said. What do you know? Said I. I know, he repeated. Then he said peevishly, I can't do it if you look at me. I really can't. It's been that, partly, all along. I'm such a nervous fellow that you put me out. Well, we had a bit of an argument. Naturally, I wanted to see, but he was as obstinate as a mule, and suddenly I had come over as tired as a dog. He tired me out. All right, I said. I won't look at you, and turned towards the mirror on the wardrobe by the bed. He started off very fast. I tried to follow him by looking in the looking-glass to see just what it was had hung. Round went his arms and hands, so, and so, and so, and then with a rush came to the last gesture of all. You stand erect and open out your arms. And so, don't you know, he stood. And then he didn't. He wasn't. I wheeled round from the looking-glass to him. There was nothing. I was alone with the flaring candles and a staggering mind. What had happened? Had anything happened? Had I been dreaming? And then, with an absurd note of finality about it, the clock upon the landing discovered the moment was ripe for striking 1. So, ping! And I was as grave and sober as a judge, with all my champagne and whiskey gone into the vast serene, feeling queer, you know, confoundedly queer. Queer, good Lord! He regarded his cigar ash for a moment. That's all that happened, he said. And then you went to bed? Asked Evans. What else was there to do? I looked Wish in the eye. We wanted to scoff, and there was something perhaps in Clayton's voice and manner that hampered our desire. And about these passes, said Sanderson. I believe I could do them now. Oh, said Sanderson, and produced a penknife and set himself to grub the dottle out of the bowl of his clay. Why don't you do them now? Said Sanderson, shutting his penknife with a click. That's what I'm going to do, said Clayton. They won't work, said Evans. If they do, I suggested. You know, I'd rather you didn't, said Wish, stretching out his legs. Why? Asked Evans. I'd rather he didn't, said Wish. But he hasn't got 'em right, said Sanderson, plugging too much tobacco in his pipe. All the same, I'd rather he didn't, said Wish. We argued with Wish. He said that for Clayton to go through those gestures was like mocking a serious matter. But you don't believe... I said. Wish glanced at Clayton, who was staring into the fire, weighing something in his mind. I do. More than half, anyhow, I do, said Wish. Clayton, said I, you're too good a liar for us. Most of it was all right, but that disappearance happened to be convincing. Tell us. It's a tale of cock and bull. He stood up without heeding me, took the middle of the hearthrug, and faced me. For a moment, he regarded his feet thoughtfully, and then, for the rest of the time, his eyes were on the opposite wall with an intent expression. He raised his 2 hands slowly to the level of his eyes, and so began. Now, Sanderson is a Freemason, a member of the Lodge of the Four Kings, which devotes itself so ably to the study and elucidation of all the mysteries of Masonry past and present. And among the students of this lodge, Sanderson is by no means the least. He followed Clayton's motions with a singular interest in his reddish eye. That's not bad, he said, when it was done. You really do, you know, put things together, Clayton, in a most amazing fashion, but there's one little detail out. I know, said Clayton. I believe you could tell which? Well? This, said Clayton, and did a queer little twist and writhing and thrust of the hands. Yes. That, you know, was what he couldn't get right, said Clayton. But how do you... Most of this business, and particularly how you invented it, I don't understand at all, said Sanderson. But just that phase, I do, he reflected. These happened to be a series of gestures connected with a certain branch of esoteric masonry. Probably you know, or else, how? He reflected still further. I do not see I can do any harm in telling you just the proper twist. After all, if you know, you know. If you don't, you don't. I know nothing, said Clayton, except what the poor devil let out last night. Well, anyhow, said Sanderson, and placed his churchwarden very carefully upon the shelf over the fireplace. Then very rapidly he gesticulated with his hands. So? Said Clayton, repeating. So, said Sanderson, and took his pipe in hand again. Ah, now, said Clayton. I can do the whole thing, right. He stood up before the waning fire and smiled at us all, but I think there was just a little hesitation in his smile. If I begin, he said. I wouldn't begin, said Wish. It's all right, said Evans. Matter is indestructible. You don't think any jiggery-pokery of this sort is going to snatch Clayton into the world of shades. Not it. You may try, Clayton, so far as I'm concerned, until your arms drop off at the wrists. I don't believe that, said Wish, and stood up and put his arm on Clayton's shoulder. You've made me half believe in this story somehow, and I don't want to see the thing done. Goodness, said I. Here's Wish frightened. I am, said Wish, with real or admirably feigned intensity. I believe that if he goes through these motions right, he'll go. He'll not do anything of the sort, I cried. There's only one way out of this world for men, and Clayton is 30 years from that. Besides, and such a ghost. Do you think? Wish interrupted me by moving. He walked out from among our chairs and stopped beside the table and stood there. Clayton, he said, you're a fool. Clayton, with a humorous light in his eyes, smiled back at him. Wish, he said, is right, and all you others are wrong. I shall go. I shall get to the end of these passes, and as the last swish whistles through the air, presto! This hearthrug will be vacant, the room will be blank amazement, and a respectably dressed gentleman of 15 stone will plump into the world of shades, I'm certain. So will you be. I decline to argue further. Let the thing be tried. No, said Wish, and made a step and ceased, and Clayton raised his hands once more to repeat the spirit's passing. By that time, you know, we were all in a state of tension, largely because of the behavior of Wish. We sat all of us with our eyes on Clayton, I, at least, with a sort of tight, stiff feeling about me, as though from the back of my skull to the middle of my thighs my body had been changed to steel. And there, with a gravity that was imperturbably serene, Clayton bowed and swayed and waved his hands and arms before us. As he drew towards the end one piled up, one tingled in one's teeth. The last gesture, I have said, was to swing the arms out wide open, with the face held up. And when at last he swung out to this closing gesture, I ceased even to breathe. It was ridiculous, of course, but you know that ghost story feeling. It was after dinner in a queer old shadowy house. Would he, after all? There he stood for one stupendous moment, with his arms open and his upturned face assured and bright in the glare of the hanging lamp. We hung through that moment as if it were an age, and then came from all of us something that was half a sigh of infinite relief and half a reassuring, no! For visibly, he wasn't going. It was all nonsense. He had told an idle story and carried it almost to conviction. That was all. And then, in that moment, the face of Clayton changed. It changed. It changed as a lit house changes when its lights are suddenly extinguished. His eyes were suddenly eyes that were fixed. His smile was frozen on his lips, and he stood there still. He stood there, very gently swaying. That moment, too, was an age. And then, you know, chairs were scraping, things were falling, and we were all moving. His knees seemed to give, and he fell forward, and Evans rose and caught him in his arms. It stunned us all. For a moment, I suppose, no one said a coherent thing. We believed it, yet could not believe it. I came out of a muddled stupefaction to find myself kneeling beside him, and his vest and shirt were torn open, and Sanderson's hand lay on his heart. Well, the simple fact before us could very well wait our convenience. There was no hurry for us to comprehend. It lay there for an hour. It lies athwart my memory, black and amazing still to this day. Clayton had indeed passed into the world that lies so near to and so far from our own, and he had gone thither by the only road that mortal man may take. But whether he did indeed pass there by that poor ghost's incantation, or whether he was stricken suddenly by apoplexy in the middle of an idle tale, as the coroner's jury would have us believe, is no matter for my judging. It is just one of those inexplicable riddles that must remain unsolved until the final solution of all things shall come. All I certainly know is that, in that very moment, in that very instant of concluding those passes, he changed and staggered and fell down before us, dead. The North Mail by Amelia B. Edwards. The circumstances I am about to relate to you have truth to recommend them. They happened to myself, and my recollection of them is as vivid as if they had taken place only yesterday. 20 years, however, have gone by since that night. During those 20 years, I have told the story to but one other person. I tell it now with a reluctance which I find it difficult to overcome. All I entreat, meanwhile, is that you will abstain from forcing your own conclusions upon me. I want nothing explained away. I desire no arguments. My mind on this subject is quite made up, and, having the testimony of my own senses to rely upon, I prefer to abide by it. Well, it was just 20 years ago, and within a day or two of the end of the grouse season. I had been out all day with my gun, and had had no sport to speak of. The wind was due east, the month December, the place a bleak wide moor in the far north of England, and I had lost my way. It was not a pleasant place in which to lose one's way, with the first feathery flakes of a coming snowstorm just fluttering down upon the heather, and the leaden evening closing in all around. I shaded my eyes with my hand, and stared anxiously into the gathering darkness, where the purple moorland melted into a range of low hills, some 10 or 12 miles distant. Not the faintest smoke wreath, not the tiniest cultivated patch, or fence, or sheep track met my eyes in any direction. There was nothing for it but to walk on, and take my chance of finding what shelter I could by the way. So I shouldered my gun again, and pushed wearily forward, for I had been on foot since an hour after daybreak, and had eaten nothing since breakfast. Meanwhile, the snow began to come down with ominous steadiness, and the wind fell. After this, the cold grew more intense, and the night came rapidly up. As for me, my prospects darkened with the darkening sky, and my heart grew heavy as I thought how my young wife was already watching for me through the window of our little inn parlor, and I imagined all the suffering in store for her throughout this weary night. We had been married 4 months, and having spent our autumn in the Highlands, were now lodging in a remote little village situated just on the verge of the great English moorlands. We were very much in love, and, of course, very happy. This morning when we parted, she had implored me to return before dusk, and I had promised her that I would. What would I not have given to keep my word? Even now, weary as I was, I felt that with supper, an hour's rest, and a guide, I might still get back to her before midnight, if only guide and shelter could be found. And all this time, the snow fell, and the night thickened. I stopped and shouted every now and then, but my shouts seemed only to make the silence deeper. Then a vague sense of uneasiness came upon me, and I began to remember stories of travelers who had walked on in the falling snow until, wearied out, they were fain to lie down and sleep their lives away. Would it be possible, I asked myself, to keep on thus through all the long dark night? Would there not come a time when my limbs must fail and my resolution give way? When I, too, must sleep the sleep of death? Death, I shuddered. How hard to die just now, when life lay all so bright before me. How hard for my darling, whose whole loving heart. But that thought was not to be borne. To banish it, I shouted again, louder and longer, and then listened eagerly. Was my shout answered? Or did I only fancy that I heard a far-off cry? I hallooed again, and again the echo followed. Then a wavering speck of light came suddenly out of the dark, shifting, disappearing, growing momentarily nearer and brighter. Running towards it at full speed, I found myself, to my great joy, face to face with an old man and a lantern. "Thank God!" was the exclamation that burst involuntarily from my lips. Blinking and frowning, he lifted the lantern and peered into my face. "What for?" growled he, sulkily. "Well, for you. I began to fear I should be lost in the snow." Then folks do get cast away hereabouts for time to time. And what's to hinder you from being cast away likewise if the Lord's so minded?" "If the Lord is so minded that you and I shall be lost together, friend, we must submit," I replied. "But I don't mean to be lost without you. How far am I now from Dwolding?" "A good 20 miles, more or less." "And the nearest village?" "The nearest village is Wyke, and that's 12 miles t'other side." "Where do you live, then?" "Out yonder," said he, with a vague jerk of the lantern. "You're going home, I presume?" "Maybe I am." "Then I'm going with you." The old man shook his head and rubbed his nose reflectively with the handle of the lantern. "It ain't a no use," growled he. "He won't let you in, not he." "We'll see about that," I replied briskly. "Who is he?" "The master." "Who is the master?" "That's nowt to you," was the unceremonious reply. "Well, well, you lead the way, and I'll engage that the master shall give me shelter and supper tonight." You can try him," muttered my reluctant guide, and still shaking his head, he hobbled gnome-like away through the falling snow. A large mass loomed up presently out of the darkness, and a huge dog rushed out, barking furiously. "Is this the house?" I asked. "Aye, it's the house. Down, Bay!" And he fumbled in his pocket for the key. I drew up close behind him, prepared to lose no chance of entrance, and saw in the little circle of light shed by the lantern that the door was heavily studded with iron nails, like the door of a prison. In another minute he had turned the key, and I had pushed past him into the house. Once inside, I looked round with curiosity, and found myself in a great raftered hall, which served apparently a variety of uses. One end was piled to the roof with corn, like a barn. The other was stored with flour sacks, agricultural implements, casks, and all kinds of miscellaneous lumber, while from the beams overhead hung rows of hams, flitches, and bunches of dried herbs for winter use. In the center of the floor stood some huge object gauntly dressed in a dingy wrapping cloth, and reaching halfway to the rafters. Lifting a corner of this cloth, I saw, to my surprise, a telescope of very considerable size, mounted on a rude movable platform with 4 small wheels. The tube was made of painted wood, bound round with bands of metal rudely fashioned. The speculum, so far as I could estimate its size by the dim light, measured at least 15 inches in diameter. While I was yet examining the instrument and asking myself whether it was not the work of some self-taught optician, a bell rang sharply. "That's for you," said my guide, with a malicious grin. "Yonder's his room." He pointed to a low black door at the opposite side of the hall. I crossed over, rapped somewhat loudly, and went in, without waiting for an invitation. A huge white-haired old man rose from a table covered with books and papers, and confronted me sternly. "Who are you?" said he. "How came you here? What do you want?" "James Murray, barrister at law, on foot across the moor. Meat, drink, and sleep." He bent his bushy brows in a portentous frown. "Mine is not a house of entertainment," he said haughtily. "Jacob, how dared you admit this stranger?" "I didn't admit him," grumbled the old man. "He followed me over the moor and shouldered his way in before me. I'm no match for 6'2". "And pray, sir, by what right have you forced an entrance into my house?" "The same by which I should have clung to your boat if I were drowning, the right of self-preservation." "Self-preservation?" "There's an inch of snow on the ground already," I replied briefly, "and it will be deep enough to cover my body before daybreak." He strode to the window, pulled aside a heavy black curtain, and looked out. "It is true," he said. "You can stay if you choose, till morning. Jacob, serve the supper." With this he waved me to a seat, resumed his own, and became at once absorbed in the studies at which I had disturbed him. I placed my gun in a corner, drew a chair to the hearth, and examined my quarters at leisure. Smaller and less incongruous in its arrangements than the hall, this room contained, nevertheless, much to awaken my curiosity. The floor was carpetless. The whitewashed walls were in parts scrawled over with strange diagrams, and in others covered with shelves crowded with philosophical instruments, the uses of many which were unknown to me. On one side of the fireplace stood a bookcase filled with dingy folios. On the other, a small organ, fantastically decorated with painted carvings of medieval saints and devils. Through the half-open door of a cupboard at the farther end of the room, I saw a long array of geological specimens, surgical preparations, crucibles, retorts, and jars of chemicals, while on the mantel shelf beside me, amid a number of small objects, stood a model of the solar system, a small galvanic battery, and a microscope. Every chair had its burden. Every corner was heaped high with books. The very floor was littered over with maps, casts, papers, tracings, and learned lumber of all conceivable kinds. I stared about me with an amazement increased by every fresh object which my eyes chanced to rest. So strange a room I had never seen, yet seemed it stranger still to find such a room in a lone farmhouse amid these wild and solitary moors. Over and over again, I looked from my host to his surroundings, and from his surroundings back to my host, asking myself who and what he could be. His head was singularly fine, but it was more the head of a poet than a philosopher. Broad in the temples, prominent over the eyes, and clothed with a rough profusion of perfectly white hair, it had all the ideality and much of the ruggedness that characterizes the head of Louis von Beethoven. There were the same deep lines about the mouth and the same stern furrows in the brow. There was the same concentration of expression. While I was yet observing him, the door opened, and Jacob brought in the supper. His master then closed his book, rose, and with more courtesy of manner than he had yet shown, invited me to the table. A dish of ham and eggs, a loaf of brown bread, and a bottle of admirable sherry were placed before me. "I have but the homeliest farmhouse fare to offer you, sir," said my entertainer. "Your appetite, I trust, will make up for the deficiencies of our larder." I had already fallen upon the viands, and now protested with the enthusiasm of a starving sportsman that I had never eaten anything so delicious. He bowed stiffly and sat down to his own supper, which consisted primitively of a jug of milk and a basin of porridge. We ate in silence, and when we had done, Jacob removed the tray. I then drew my chair back to the fireside. My host, somewhat to my surprise, did the same, and turning abruptly towards me, said, "Sir, I have lived here in strict retirement for 23 years. During that time, I have not seen as many strange faces, and I have not read a single newspaper. You are the first stranger who has crossed my threshold for more than 4 years. Will you favor me with a few words of information respecting that outer world from which I have parted company so long?" "Pray, interrogate me," I replied. "I am heartily at your service." He bent his head in acknowledgment, leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees, and his chin supported in the palms of his hands, stared fixedly into the fire, and proceeded to question me. His inquiries related chiefly to scientific matters, with the later progress of which, as applied to the practical purpose of life, he was almost wholly unacquainted. No student of science myself, I replied as well as my slight information permitted, but the task was far from easy, and I was much relieved when, passing from interrogation to discussion, he began pouring forth his own conclusions upon the facts which I had been attempting to place before him. He talked, and I listened spellbound. He talked till I believe he almost forgot my presence, and only thought aloud. I had never heard anything like it then. I have never heard anything like it since. Familiar with all systems of all philosophies, subtle in analysis, bold in generalization, he poured forth his thoughts in an uninterrupted stream, and, still leaning forward in the same moody attitude, with his eyes fixed upon the tire, wandered from topic to topic, from speculation to speculation, like an inspired dreamer. From practical science to mental philosophy, from electricity in the wire to electricity in the nerve, from Watts to Mesmer, from Mesmer to Reichenbach, from Reichenbach to Swedenborg, Spinoza, Condillac, Descartes, Berkeley, Aristotle, Plato, and the Magi and mystics of the East were transitions which, however bewildering in their variety and scope, seemed easy and harmonious upon his lips as sequence in music. By and by, I forgot now by what link of conjecture or illustration, he passed on to that field which lies beyond the boundary line of even conjectural philosophy, and reaches no man knows whither. He spoke of the soul and its aspirations, of the spirit and its powers, of second sight, prophecy of those phenomena which under the names of ghosts, specters, and supernatural appearances have been denied by the skeptics and attested by the credulous of all ages. The world, he said, grows hourly more and more skeptical of all that lies beyond its own narrow radius, and our men of science foster the fatal tendency. They condemn as fable all that resists experiment. They reject as false all that cannot be brought to the test of the laboratory or the dissecting room. Against what superstition have they waged so long and obstinate a war as against the belief in apparitions? And yet what superstition has maintained its hold upon the minds of men so long and so firmly? Show me any fact in physics, in history, in archaeology, which is supported by testimonies so wide and so various, attested by all races of men in all ages and in all climates, by the soberest sages of antiquity, by the rudest savages of today, by the Christian, the pagan, the pantheist, the materialist. This phenomenon is treated as a nursery tale by the philosophers of our century. Circumstantial evidence weighs with them as a feather in the balance. The comparison of causes with effects, however valuable in physical sense, is put aside as worthless and unreliable. The evidence of competent witness, however conclusive, in a court of justice counts for nothing. He who pauses before he pronounces is condemned a trifler. He who believes is a dreamer or a fool. He spoke with bitterness, and having said thus, relapsed for some minutes into silence. Presently he raised his head from his hands, and added with an altered voice and manner, I, sir, paused, investigated, believed, and was not ashamed to state my convictions to the world. I, too, was branded as a visionary, held up to ridicule by my contemporaries, and hooted from that field of science in which I had labored with honor during all the best years of my life. These things happened just 23 years ago. Since then, I have lived as you see me living now, and the world has forgotten me as I have forgotten the world. You have my history. It is a very sad one, I murmured, scarcely knowing what to answer. It is a very common one, he replied. I have only suffered for the truth, as many a better and wiser man have suffered before me. He rose, as if desirous of ending the conversation, and went over to the window. It has ceased snowing, he observed, and dropped the curtain, and came back to the fireside. Ceased? I exclaimed, starting eagerly to my feet. Oh, if it were only possible! But no, it is hopeless. Even if I could find Ray way across the moor, I could not walk 20 miles tonight. Walk 20 miles tonight? Repeated my host. What are you thinking of? Of my wife, I replied impatiently. Of my young wife, who does not know that I have lost my way, and who is at this moment breaking her heart with suspense and terror. Where is she? At Dwolding, 20 miles away. At Dwolding, he echoed thoughtfully. Yes, the distance is 20 miles, but are you so anxious to save the next 6 or 8 hours? So anxious that I would give 10 guineas at this moment for a guide and a horse. Your wish can be gratified at a less costly rate, he said, smiling. The night mail from the north, which changes horses at Dwolding, passes within 5 miles of this spot, and will be due at a certain crossroad in about an hour and a quarter. If Jacob were to go with you across the moor and put you in the old coach road, you could find your way, I suppose, to where it joins the new one? Easily. Gladly. He smiled again, rang the bell, gave the old servant his directions, and taking a bottle of whiskey and a wine-glass from the cupboard in which he kept his chemicals, said, The snow lies deep, and it will be difficult walking tonight on the moor. A glass of Asquaba before you start. I would have declined the spirit, but he pressed it on me, and I drank it. It went down my throat like liquid flame and almost took my breath away. It is strong, he said, but it will help to keep out the cold, and now you have no moments to spare. Good night. I thanked him for his hospitality and would have shaken hands, but that he had turned away before I could finish my sentence. In another minute I had traversed the hall, Jacob had locked the outer door behind me, and we were on the wide white moor. Although the wind had fallen, it was still bitterly cold. Not a star glimmered in the black vault overhead. Not a sound save the rapid crunching of the snow beneath our feet disturbed the heavy stillness of the night. Jacob, not too well pleased with his mission, shambled on before in sullen silence, his lantern in hand and his shadow at his feet. I followed with my gun over my shoulder, as little inclined for conversation as himself. My thoughts were full of my late host. His voice yet rang in my ears. His eloquence had yet held my imagination captive. I remember to this day with surprise how my overexcited brain retained whole sentences and part of sentences, troops of brilliant images and fragments of splendid reasoning, in the very words in which he had uttered them. Musing thus over what I had heard, and strived to recall a lost link here and there, I strode on at the heels of my guide, absorbed and unobservant. Presently, at the end, as it seemed to me, of only a few minutes, he came to a sudden halt, and said, "Yon's your road. Keep the stone fence to your right, and you can't fail of the way." "This, then, is the old coach road?" "Aye, 'tis the old coach road." "And how far do I go before I reach the crossroads?" "Nigh upon 3 miles." I pulled out my purse, and he became more communicative. "The road's a fair road enough," said he, "for foot passengers, but 'twas over steep and narrow for the northern traffic. You'll mind where the parapet's broken away. Close again the signpost. It's never been mended since the accident." "What accident?" The night mail pitched right over into the valley below. A good 60 feet and more. Just at the worst bit of road in the whole country." "Horrible! Were many lives lost?" "All. 4 were found dead, and t'other 2 died the next morning." "How long is it since this happened?" "Just 9 year." "Near the signpost, you say? I will bear it in mind. Good night." "Good night, sir, and thank ye." Jacob pocketed his half-crown, made a faint pretense of touching his hat, and trudged back the way he had come. I watched the light of his lantern till it had quite disappeared, and then turned to pursue my way alone. This was no longer a matter of the slightest difficulty, for despite the dead darkness overhead, the line of stone fence showed distinctly enough against the pale gleam of the snow. How silent it seemed now, with only my own footsteps to listen to. How silent and how solitary. A strange, disagreeable sense of loneliness stole over me. I walked faster. I hummed a fragment of a tune. I cast up enormous sums in my head and accumulated them at compound interest. I did my best, in short, to forget the startling speculations to which I had just been listening, and to some extent I succeeded. Meanwhile, the night air seemed to become colder and colder, and though I walked fast, I found it impossible to keep myself warm. My feet were like ice. I lost sensation in my hands, and grasped my gun mechanically. I even breathed with difficulty, as though instead of traversing a quiet north country highway, I was scaling the uppermost heights of some gigantic Alp. This last symptom became presently so distressing that I was forced to stop for a few minutes and lean against the stone fence. As I did so, I chanced to look back upon the road, and there, to my infinite relief, I saw a distant point of light, like the gleam of an approaching lantern. I at first concluded that Jacob had retraced his steps and followed me, but even as the conjecture presented itself, a second light flashed into sight, a light evidently parallel with the first and approaching at the same rate of motion. It needed no second thought to show me that these must have been the carriage lamps of some private vehicle, though it seemed strange that any private vehicle should take a road professedly disused and dangerous. There could be no doubt, however, of that fact, for the lamps grew larger and brighter every moment, and I even fancied I could already see the dark outline of the carriage between them. It was coming up very fast and quite noiselessly, the snow being nearly a foot deep under the wheels. And now the body of the vehicle became distinctly visible behind the lamps. It looked strangely lofty. A sudden suspicion flashed upon me. Was it possible I had passed the crossroads in the dark without observing the signpost, and could this be the very coach which I had come to meet? No need to ask myself that question a second time, for here it came round the bend of the road, guard and driver, 1 outside passenger, and 4 steaming greys, all wrapped in a soft haze of light through which the lamps blazed out like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped forward, waved my hat, and shouted. The mail came down at full speed and passed me. For a moment I feared that I had not been seen or heard, but it was only for a moment. The coachman pulled up, the guard, muffled to the eyes in capes and comforters, and apparently sound asleep in the rumble, neither answered my hail nor made the slightest effort to dismount. The outside passenger did not even turn his head. I opened the door for myself and looked in. There were but 3 travelers inside, so I stepped in, shut the door, slipped into the vacant corner, and congratulated myself on my good fortune. The atmosphere of the coach seemed, if possible, colder than that of the outer air, and was pervaded by a singularly damp and disagreeable smell. I looked round at my fellow passengers. They were all 3 men, and all silent. They did not seem to be asleep, but each leaned back in his corner of the vehicle, as if absorbed in his own reflections. I attempted to open a conversation. "How intensely cold it is tonight," I said, addressing my opposite neighbor. He lifted his head, looked at me, but made no reply. "The winter," I added, "seems to have begun in earnest." Although the corner in which he sat was so dim that I could distinguish none of his features very clearly, I saw that his eyes were still turned full upon me, and yet he answered never a word. At any other time I should have felt, and perhaps expressed, some annoyance, but at that moment I felt too ill to do either. The icy coldness of the night air had struck a chill to my very marrow, and the strange spell inside the coach was affecting me with an intolerable nausea. I shivered from head to foot, and, turning to my left-hand neighbor, asked if he had any objection to an open window. He neither spoke nor stirred. I repeated the question somewhat more loudly, but with the same result. Then I lost patience and let the sash down. As I did so, the leather strap broke in my hand, and I observed that the glass was covered with a thick coat of mildew, the accumulation apparently of years. My attention being thus drawn to the condition of the coach, I examined it more narrowly, and saw by the uncertain light of the outer lamps that it was in the last state of dilapidation. Every part of it was not only out of repair, but in a state of actual decay. The sashes splintered at the touch, the leather fittings were crusted over with mold, and literally rotting from the woodwork. The floor was almost breaking away beneath my feet. The whole machine, in short, was foul with damp, and had evidently been dragged from some outhouse in which it had been mouldering away for years to do another day or two of duty on the road. I turned to the third passenger, whom I had not yet addressed, and hazarded one more remark. "This coach," I said, "is in deplorable condition. The regular mail, I suppose, is under repair?" He moved his head slowly and looked me in the face, without speaking a word. I shall never forget that look while I live. I turn cold at heart even now when I recall it. His eyes glowed with a fiery, unnatural luster. His face was livid as the face of a corpse. His bloodless lips were drawn back as if in agony of death, and showed the gleaming teeth between. The words that I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a strange horror came upon me. My sight had by this time become used to the gloom of the coach, and I could see with tolerable distinctness. I turned to my opposite neighbor. He, too, was looking at me with the same startling pallor on his face, and the same stony glitter in his eyes. I passed my hand across my brow. I turned to the passenger on the seat beside my own, and saw— oh, heaven! How shall I describe what I saw? I saw that he was no living man, and none of them were living men, like myself. A pale phosphorescent light, the light of putrefaction, played upon their awful faces, upon their hair, dank with the dews of the grave, upon their clothes earth-stained and dropping to pieces, upon their hands which were as the hands of corpses long buried. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes were living, and those eyes were all turned menacingly upon me. A shriek of terror, a wild, unintelligible cry for help and mercy burst from my lips as I flung myself against the door and strove in vain to open it. In that single instant, brief and vivid as a landscape beheld in the flesh of summer lightning, I saw the moon shining down through a rift of stormy cloud, the ghastly signpost rearing its warning finger by the wayside, the broken parapet, the plunging horses, the black gulf below. Then the coach reeled like a ship at sea. Then came a mighty crash, a sense of crushing pain, and then darkness. It seemed as if years had gone by when I awoke one morning from a deep sleep and found my wife watching by my bedside. I will pass over the scene that ensued and give you in a half-dozen words the tale she told me with tears of thanksgiving. I had fallen over a precipice, close against the junction of the old coach road and the new, and had only been saved from certain death by lighting upon a deep snowdrift that had accumulated at the foot of the rock beneath. In this snowdrift I was discovered at daybreak by a couple of shepherds, who carried me to the nearest shelter and brought a surgeon to my aid. The surgeon found me in a state of raving delirium, with a broken arm and a compound fracture of the skull. The letters in my pocketbook showed my name and address. My wife was summoned to nurse me, and, thanks to youth and a fine constitution, I came out of danger at last. The place of my fall, I need scarcely say, was precisely that at which a frightful accident had happened to the North Mail 9 years before. I never told my wife the fearful events which I have just related to you. I told the surgeon who attended me, but he treated the whole adventure as a mere dream born of the fever in my brain. We discussed the question over and over again, until we found that we could discuss it with temper no longer, and then we dropped it. Others may form what conclusions they please. I know that 20 years ago, I was the fourth inside passenger in the Phantom coach. I hope you guys enjoyed the Halloween classics we read today. Let me know what you think, or if you have any suggestions for stories you'd like me to read in the future. Do you have a favorite scary story? Let me know. I will have the book sources I used in the description if you'd like to do more reading yourself. And if you do have some time, please rate and review this podcast on whichever app you're using to listen. It really does help me out, and I do so appreciate it. Thank you guys for joining me today, and I hope you have a wonderful day and a fantastic Halloween season.